I do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Mr. Merrick.
Yes, thank you, sir. I'll call our next witness, which is our last witness for the day, Professor Tracey McIntosh, who's already seated. Nau mai hara mai e te rangatira. Tracey, welcome this afternoon.
Professor, just as we start, there is a requirement of the Inquiries Act 2013 that as Chair I ask you, do you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence that you will give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Merrick.
Thank you, sir. Professor McIntosh, behind tab number 23, I think you've got in front of you a signed copy of your brief of evidence for this hearing.
That's correct.
And can you just confirm that that's true and correct?
I can confirm that.
Thank you. With that done, let's just start with some introductions. Ko wai koe no hea koe.
Ko mātātua te waka, ko Ngāti Kaura te hapu, ko Tūhoi te iwi, ko Tracey McIntosh aho. I'd just like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Commissioners, recognise the importance and significance of this work, and wish you great strength and great wisdom in what you're doing. I'd like to acknowledge specifically the survivors. Through your strength, through your knowledge, through your expertise, through your insight, that will help us navigate the path we need to go forward. I would also like to acknowledge those who did not survive the system, and with very heavy heart recognise the damage and the devastation that the system has done. So recognise those who for a range of reasons may remain silent, and for those that have been silenced. In terms of my own work, I want to recognise all of those the people that have shaped and informed and enlightened me and educated me under conditions of incarceration. They are the experts of their own condition. They are the experts that I will be drawing on in regards to this brief of summary. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koe I kōrero ke mō rātou ko wheturangitia, those that have passed away, rātou ki a rātou, tātou ki a tātou te hunga ora, ko tai mai I rungi te kaupapa o te rā. So to bring us back to those of us who are here today present, and I acknowledge your acknowledgements in full. Can we start, that being said, probably not a natural conclusion to start, or next step to start with what some would describe as a kumara kōrero, to talk about yourself. So I'll lead you through that.
Thank you.
Can we just confirm for those who may not know you, those who are watching, for example, on the live stream, that you're currently a Professor of Indigenous Studies at and co-head of Wānanga o Waipapa, that's the School of Māori Studies and Pacific Studies at the University of Auckland.
Yes, that's correct.
And formerly a co-director of Ngā Pai o Te Maramatanga, New Zealand's Māori Centre of Research Excellence, hosted by the University of Auckland.
Yes, that's correct.
Previously you've held roles at the head of sociology at University of Auckland.
Yes.
And relevant to some of the evidence that we've heard, you were in 2018 and 2019 a member of the Independent Welfare Expert Advisory Group, established by the Minister of Social Development.
That's right.
Before moving on, I wonder if we might just pause on that experience that you had, because we've heard over the last few days around one of the core failures being the failure to address, I think, what some witnesses have described as the antecedents to state care, namely poverty, housing and addiction. Given that experience, I'll just leave it open to you to make comment around, firstly, the role that the welfare system may have to play in that state care cycle, if you like.
Yes.
And over the page at paragraph 8, you've also talked about your role on Te Uepu Hapaite, Te Ora, the Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group. And the reason why I'm asking this is because you've spoken about the hui and forums that you went to around the country for both of those kaupapa. So how has state care played out within those contexts, can I ask?
So if I could just first look at the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, so particularly the report Whakamana Tangata, Restoring Dignity to the Social Security in New Zealand, which was publicly released in May this year. I think that's a very important...
Professor, can I intervene a moment?
Yes.
To ask you as you speak to keep your eye on the stenotyper, but also to be aware of the signers. So if you look towards both of them, you'll get the sense of the pace at which you'll need to keep so that they can keep up.
Aroha mai korua. So in thinking about the report, Whakamana Tangata, I think that report is of great significance to this Commission, both in terms of its content, but also in terms of its recommendations. And largely that is because when we're looking at the many people who churn through our welfare system, churn seamlessly between the welfare system and our criminal justice system. And so it's a really important element to look at where in many parts of this country and in many parts of our state agencies we do transitions poorly. It is of great concern that that particular transition between those two systems can be so seamless. So certainly what we recognise is that when we look at our people who are living in deprivation and scarcity, who encounter far greater levels of social marginalisation and whose contact with the state is nearly continuous, but often a poor encounter, and where the operating mechanism, both within the state system of the prisons and often through particularly an increasing level of sanctions within the welfare system, means that you have an operating mechanism that can often be characterised as coercive control. And what this does to those that sit within the system, closer to me. So I think that that's a really very significant area. As you noted, we travelled, I was a member of both the Welfare Expert Advisory Group and Te Uepu Hapai Te Ora, the Justice Advisory Group. Both of those groups travelled throughout the country, meeting indeed with thousands of people. You know, we had whānau, we had forum, we had hui throughout the country, both in main urban areas as well as small areas and rural and quite isolated areas. And the overwhelming sentiment that we got, certainly out of those that we met from the criminal justice system, was the emotion of grief. Interestingly, probably the overwhelming emotion we got from those that we encountered as a part of the welfare group was anger. And I think these are very powerful emotions in regards to very significant numbers of our people going through the system. What it means to not, you know, the need for the restoration of mana was clear in our workings, whether it was working through the welfare group or whether it was working through the Justice Group. The recommendations that we see in Whakamana Tangata, I think, are really significant, as I said, in terms of the Commission's work as well, in terms of the way that we don't just uplift members of our communities, but actually how we uplift the nation.
In the course of those hui, whono, and other forums, was anything said about the state of children in care?
So it was probably one of the most talked about elements, certainly within the justice one with Te Waipu, but also with the welfare one. So we heard the very first hui that went to was in Hastings, and the very first person who spoke to us in a public forum spoke to us about, first talking about the release from prison and the incredible difficulties that they encountered. But also in that, in speaking to that, also then spoke around their history in terms of being in care. And so that was our very first encounter under the Welfare Expert Advisory Group. Throughout the country, that grief that I spoke about, and I talked about it as that what we saw was a landscape of devastation in terms of the mamae and the intergenerational reach of the disruption of whānau, of the loss of children, and that many of us who talked about the loss of children had themselves experienced state care. And so their anxiety was far more heightened around their children because of what they had experienced.
In your brief at paragraph 11, you outline some further relevant experience about work done in the Auckland Region Women's Correctional Facility. Can you just tell us a little bit about that at this stage?
Yes, so I've been going into the women's prison for well over a decade now. I go in on a weekly basis. Though Māori and Indigenous incarceration is a research area for me, so it's in terms of my professional life, it's an important area of research. This work is what informs my professional life. It has been, I guess, of the most significance to me personally. So I go in as a volunteer, and I run a range of programs, including a creative writing program and education programs within the prison. But really what it is, we call it these names, it's about human work. It's about what it means to be human together. And I think that is really the most significant part of the work. And without a doubt, all of my own work has been informed and shaped and enlightened by working with particularly wahine Māori and particularly young Māori women. I have worked with some of those women since the day they entered the prison, in some cases at the age of 16, into the adult prison. With some of those, 12 years later, I'm still seeing the same young women who have yet to be released.
And you alluded to it in your early acknowledgements about bringing that kōrero to us today, and we're privileged to have that. And so at this stage, I just want to flag for those who have the brief of evidence that we will depart from the order of the brief of evidence because you bring real life experience of people that you've worked alongside, and to that end, I think we could pick up our kōrero at paragraph 60, where you talk about the life of Stan.
Yes, and I'd just like to recognise and acknowledge Stan Costa in this moment. Stan and I have worked together for 6-7 years, and Stan is unable to be here today, And so what I'll be drawing on here, he gives us a koha to all of us.
And by that, you've spoken with Stan, and
I have spoken with Stan.
given his approval for you to speak about his story.
I'm hoping that he'll be watching it.
And, well, if you ask Stan, ngā mihi nui ki a koe, and you're drawing on work that you've previously published also.
That's right.
In conjunction with Stan.
So we've published together. We've actually published quite a bit together, and also with Dominic Andre, who's also been an author on the work that we have done together. And to recognise that Stan is far more than a research participant. He is both author and author of this work.
And so, I'll leave it with you.
So I think that while Stan's experience is a unique experience, it is one that is much more collectively shared. So I'll speak about that. So Stan's most ongoing intimate relationship has been with the state. And I think that's a really significant space for him to imagine the world without the state absolutely at the centre is very difficult for him. When I say it's the most intimate relationship it had, it doesn't mean that encounter and that relationship has been a good one, but it's certainly been the most prolonged and sustained relationship that he has had. So Stan is, he's...
If we could pause the hearing, please.
Thank you, Mr. Merrick. Please continue with Professor McIntosh's evidence.
Thank you. Now, Professor, we beginning to talk about the narrative about Stan, and I just wanted to ask a question. We have heard the different life stories of people in the course of this hearing. Can you comment on what some of the common events in Stan's journey through state care might have been, or some of the common threads to that?
So I think some of the areas where you see really high levels of commonality for many people who have experienced state care is that often that the whānau, even prior to the birth of the child, has been under a level of scrutiny or surveillance by the state. So the state has often had quite high levels of intervention already within the family. Like many others, again characterised by living under conditions, as I said earlier, of deprivation and scarcity, and that a particular event, in this case in terms of the death of the mother, which meant that the children, through a range of processes, were then placed into state care. As I said, there had already been the Department of Social Welfare, as it was at the time. The family was already very well known to them, so that would not be an uncommon feature. So I think that we've heard this morning around placement instability, for example, and that certainly is a feature of Stan's life as well. There were a number of children involved. In the beginning, there was an attempt to keep those children together, given that they had suffered, one of those most significant and profound losses that children can have in terms of the death of their mother. So there were some attempts made to keep those children together, though within weeks that approach was abandoned, largely due to the difficulties of placing children into foster care together. And so very high levels of placement instability. So in that first year, he experienced, and this was 1969, and so in that first year, he experienced 5 placements in 3 different geographical regions, 2 of those in the North Island and 1 in the South Island. So that was also the level of movement that he experienced during that time.
How did the progression through residential homes impact, for example?
So it's interesting when we look at the reports, and so what we did to try to better understand his own story was through the Official Information Act, applied, given this very close relationship with the state, applied for all documents that had been held on him. And this was a huge amount of documentation. So one of the things that you can really see there, and again, so characteristic of this period, 1969, and by 1975, he's a 15-year-old, 16-year-old. So if we follow that documentation through, we see this movement into foster care, sometimes into group homes, into the larger ones, Epuni, Owairaka, those homes, but sometimes in foster care. And we see really this incredible constant escalation from those homes. So the reports are interesting because the reports nearly are formulaic. In the beginning, when there's the placement, there's usually a quite hopeful report that this person is shy but is settling in. That's sort of the nature of the first report. Then you start to see the second and third report where there are concerns around either behaviour, a range of different things, not outgoing, not talking, not doing those sorts of things, until you start to get these final reports before movement saying not settling in, disruptive either to the family life of the foster home or disruptive in the larger home, and then moving on. In one case, there was documentation where a foster family, a Pākehā foster family, who had been optimistic that they would be able to, not so much care, because that's not really the language that's used in the report, but that they would be able to control this young child that had been placed with them. They seemed to be optimistic that they would be able to do that. Second report, not settling in. Third report, finding it very difficult. And the concern that they raised was, whilst they did not wish to continue with the placement, they were concerned that other people in the community in which they lived would think that they were not able to control a Māori child. And the Department of Social Welfare response to that, and the report written, was that they understood those concerns and that the placement would be out of the community. And so there we got the sense that the concerns of the foster family were more important than the concerns around a 9-year-old child. And so we have heard about the sort of dehumanising element of children not really having the rights as children to be children and cared for, and where the adults and adult needs were much more likely to be met than the needs of the children. And so we see this movement through into different forms of care facilities, and with higher levels of constraint and surveillance being a characteristic of those movements. We've heard over this contextual hearing about the use of secure units, and this is also a characteristic of Stan's story. So much so that by the time he had moved up through into the prison system, secure units were by far the most familiar and indeed familiar places for him, and indeed the places that he sought. So within the brief of evidence, it does talk about that first time going into a Puni Boys home, for example, into the secure unit, the types of induction practices, particularly the cleansing rituals that he went through, which again has been characteristic of many of the stories that have been heard, and I'm sure will be heard as the inquiry continues.
Just one final topic, if you like, before we move on to your work with women in prison. How has that system played a role in gang affiliation and gang membership from that narrative that you're talking about, Stan?
So here, particularly looking at my research, which looks at the state's role in gang formation and just how significant the role the state has played, particularly in the early formation of the gangs. So if we think about 1975 as a particular sort of apex year in regards to, you've got within the youth resident system, 80% of the young boys are Māori. During that time, you sort of see just how important, particularly if we need boys' home, but certainly not only that boys' home, how significant that was in terms of gang formation, that the very early members, the vast majority had gone through that home or through other homes. And certainly, again, with Stan's narrative, that is a significant feature as well. The roles of being alienated, of being marginalised, of being in what it'd be called forced association with others, completely, in many cases, completely removed from their own whakapapa, completely removed from their own place, their own whenua, and the types of solidarity that we have. And so in the brief of evidence, what that means in terms of the new forms of collective that were formed during that period. So I think that the state's role in gang formation, particularly in early gang formation, is incredibly significant and cannot be overstated.
Can we now turn to paragraph 89 of your brief of evidence, unless there was anything under that heading that you wanted to touch
I guess what I'd just like to stress is around this transition. So from a child who was put formally into state care as a 9-year-old in 1969, that the next 30 years would be characterised by being totally institutionalised, either through the home system or through the prison system. And in fact, on the day where the state extinguished their obligations as guardian and as parent, was the day that he entered into the adult prison system. That's how seamless that state engagement was. And so this is someone who has then spent 25 years within the prison system, often for relatively short lags, though there have been some significant ones in there as well. And so you think of that child, that 9-year-old child, experiencing the most profound loss, having already suffered significant hardship prior to being put into state care, and that any aspiration that he had in terms of the qualities that had been identified and recognised, you do see some of those in the reports, that they were quashed and they were squandered. And that it has completely marked the trajectory of not only his life, but the broader whānau life, and there has been intergenerational impact.
In your brief evidence, you talk about intergenerational impact, particularly as we should discuss it around the role that gender has to play and the reach, and it's probably a good point to pick up your kōrero about the work that you do with women in prison, And so, if we could do that topic.
Yes. So just looking at the brief in 1918, in paragraph 89, I just note that the really distinguishing feature of an incarcerated woman is this very common, they have really strong common histories, common characteristics. One of those very common characteristics is around trauma, certainly much, much higher than we'd find in general population. Our men who are also incarcerated have extremely high levels of trauma as well, much higher than in general population, but for women it's very marked. Very high levels of victimisation, particularly around violence and around sexual violence. And that's an international trend that we see. And also just to note that incarcerated women are much more likely, much more likely than general population to have been in state care and to have suffered abuse within the environment of state care. In terms of the intergenerational reach, what we have seen in New Zealand is this incredibly, as we know, we have a very common social statistic that we're very familiar with, which is on one hand, a very high incarceration rate, and particularly the gross disproportionality of Māori within our prison system. And what we've seen over the last 10 years is the incredible increase in terms of Māori women's incarceration. And so while, for example, Māori men make up around 51% of the male prison population, Māori women make up around 63% of the women's prison population. And if you disaggregate that for age, particularly looking at from, say, 16 to 25, it is far higher. So the intergenerational reach of that, the impact of having such high numbers of wahine Māori in prison is incredibly significant. There is much less research done. There's quite a lot of research on the impact of having a father in prison for children. There's much less research on having a mother in prison. But what research has been done, and my own research would support this, is that the impact on children is so immediate. So certainly it is not a good thing to have a father in prison. The damage is severe and sustained. Having your mother in prison, as I said, the impact is much more immediate. Women are much more likely to be the sole carers or the primary carers of children. And so on an arrest, for example, it is much more likely that there will be disruption for those children immediately. It's much more likely that they will be uplifted if they're unable to find family members to take them. So you have a much more immediate impact with women being in prison. Because I've had a particular focus on young women or young wahine Māori in prison, many of them who have yet to be mothers, then there's some other really interesting work around what that means and the impact of those who become mothers after they've already experienced incarceration. And as I noted, in the most cases have also experienced high levels of state care.
You talked about the impact of having a father in prison. And do you have some experience to draw on with those that you've worked with, young women, for example, around the disruption to the maternal whakapapa?
So that has been a really significant feature, is how many of the young women I've worked with, it's an interesting thing. Most of the women I've worked with, in fact nearly all of them, they know their whakapapa. They know where they come from. Some of them have actually been quite involved in their marae life As many of these very young women come from small town New Zealand. But when we have done whakapapa work, when we're sort of doing that as part of the work that we do, very often they're not able to, they don't have the same sort of access to their whakapapa through their father's side. And this is when a lot of those issues actually come out, when they realise, because their father was absent, that their father was in and out of prison, that they had not really had an ongoing or sustained relationship with their father. And sometimes this was most apparent in regards to their names, because when they came in, I'd know their name, often had most beautiful whakapapa names, both first names and their last names. And often I would talk about that name. And a very common response was, yeah, that's my dad's name. I don't know much about that side of my family. And so that disruption, that severing, it's not, so that part of their whakapapa has yet to be revealed to those women.
A parallel kōrero about disruption, which, well, actually, no, it links to whakapapa because that ties you to place. Has there been some experience that you've had around disruption of place as a result of state care, the state care and prison context?
Yes, particularly for where young girls are placed. As we've seen, the vast majority of people being put into place care have largely been young boys. And so often there are far less facilities or placements for young girls. So they're much more likely to be at some geographical distance from where, and that's the same with the prisons. We only have 3 women's prisons, so there's also, that continues that same continuum. And so that loss of place has come up as really significant in terms of the women's lives. One of the things, just if you'll allow me to, one of the things that we often do when the young women come in is that I'll have a map of New Zealand, and so I tell them, show me all the places that you've lived on this map. And it's an interesting one because it allows, if there is any sort of issues around whakapapa, often if they sort of say, I was here, that's where my nan was, you're able to get that sort of sense, but usually they know that. So they're able to show where they're from in terms of where their whakapapa lines are from, and also where they've lived. And so in some cases you might see a high alignment from where they live to where they whakapapa to. One of the really interesting things is because of, due to placement, state care placement, just where they are all over the place. So for some very young people who come into the prison under 18, when you see how many places they've been placed in, nearly all of them excluded from the compulsory education system, as I note in my brief of evidence, by 13, and yet have been to up to 25 schools, and yet have been excluded from the compulsory education system by 13. And one of the first time it happened to me, it really marked me as we were doing this particular piece of work, and there was quite a number of young women who I was doing it with. We were doing it as a piece of group work, and one of the young ones was explaining all of her places that she had lived. And they were in common with many of the other girls because they'd been in the same homes together. And I noted, and we were in Wiri, at the women's prison in Wiri, and I noted that she hadn't put Auckland or even Manukau on, she hadn't put a mark on it. And I said to her, you haven't put Auckland on it. And she just looked at me and she went, oh no, I've never lived there. And yet here we were on that whenua, in Auckland, and that young girl was going to be there for quite a number of years, and yet truly she had never lived there. And it really made me think about what it means to live.
You've also talked about, for some of the women who experienced abuse in state care and their thoughts to their own children. Did you want to comment on that?
So certainly one of the most pervasive narratives that I've heard from the women who are incarcerated is around their stories of abuse in state care, and the level of anxiety for those that are now mothers who have in turn their children in state care, the level of anxiety and stress and ongoing trauma that produces. And the reason that it produces such a high level of trauma is because of their fears and their expectations that their child or children will be harmed in state care. And unfortunately, because I've been going in there such a long time, there have been far too many cases where that has been confirmed, where their children have been harmed in state care.
As part of that, what have you come to know for some about the role state care has had to play in their parents' or their grandparents' lives?
And as noted in the brief of evidence, in some cases, well, in many cases, their parents, of the young women that I've had, their parents have experienced state care, and in some cases, their grandparents have experienced state care. And so what that means in terms of their own expectations around family, their own understandings of... It's interesting because their desire to have flourishing, beautiful family life is constantly articulated, and that is constantly against the idea of the real fear that is impossible to realise. Just very recently, only in the last week, I spoke to a young woman who will be released sometime in the relatively near future, who is hoping to be able to, from her point of view, rescue not her own children, she's not had children yet, but that she hopes to be able to rescue, that using her words, her whānau members, in one case her sister's child, in one case her first cousin's children, from state care. Having to talk about the very significant difficulties she's likely to encounter in trying to take those children into her care was quite a difficult conversation to have.
Now, before we... I've got a couple of questions really left around this kōrero that we're having about the work you've been doing with wahine Māori in prison. The first is, I understand you've brought a piece of creative writing that you would like to share with us.
Yes.
I think this might be an appropriate time to do that before I last question about the subject.
So if I could just give some context for this work, and again, I did speak to the young woman prior to coming in here, saying that if the opportunity was afforded, would it be all right for me to read one of her poems? And again, you know, she gave that incredible, with love, and really wanted to be able to bring some element of her experience to this place. That at the moment, she's not in a position to be able to speak directly to the commissioners and to others, and so that is really important to bring that lived experience within this group. Again, to give context of someone who entered into the system, both the state care system and into the prison system at a very young age, who has done her growing up within that environment. So she has grown up under conditions of confinement, containment and incarceration. And I've chosen one. It was very difficult to choose which one. An incredibly talented poet, and this poetry has been read in a whole range of places, and she goes under the pseudonym of Maya. And it was difficult for me to choose one that I thought for the commissioners that would capture it, because in all of the ones, and you can see that there is significant amount of work here, but there's 2 lines in this one that I think are really significant for the commission. So again, someone who is early, you know, the real characteristics of this young woman's life, very unique and specific to her, but certainly part of a much more collective experience as well. Excluded very early from the compulsory education system, experienced great levels of social harm, and the tragedy of then going on to perpetrate harm against others, and in no way wanting to trivialise or underestimate the harm that she recognises that she has caused herself. So I've chosen this poem. She gave me, so I've chosen this poem, and the poem is entitled "Misery So Pure." I also read this poem at the Māori Justice Hui in Aotearoa in August in Rotorua for some of the same reasons. Broken hearts fear the loudest. A prisoner's tears are seen as groundless. Broken bones can always heal, but words seep in, painful to feel. Trapped souls struggle in the arms of hell, but in the cell, the walls never tell. Broken dreams reveal a forgotten gall, yet a scream doesn't seem to be heard at all. Surrendered in the heart of hate, the devil inside never turns up late. Broken roads lead to a complete end. A prisoner's journey is always just around the bend. Living life only to die inside the broken and tainted heart I hide. The worst thing in life that you will never see is being captured, having never been free. The deepest and the darkest places to be, waiting for the system to release me, killing all innocence and hope, but not the pain or the mess, devastation caused with only me to blame, no one to love, no one to hear. The passion and the addiction to fear, a waiting for life to begin and start. This was the journey of my heart. In the end, what more is left? To live in hell? What then next? To recreate the cell whenever I'm near, but I'm still breathing and I'm still here.
Kia ora. That leads me to my last question, which, well, there's 2 things, one relating to resilience and the other talking about hope. And do you have some comment from your observation about the resilience of the people that you've worked with?
An incredible level of resilience, and resilience that has been born out of struggle and torment. An incredible potential to flourish. For me, in many ways, it's a social indictment that the incredible potential that I've been able to recognise, to see within the prison is recognised, occurs behind the wire. What types of intervention? We have heard some of that this morning, and certainly the inquiry has heard it. The Whakamana Tangata report speaks to it. Hei Wakaroimata report of Te Wepu Hapa i Te Ora speaks to it, is those early interventions, the way at the community level, at the hapu level, the types of things that we're able to do to allow lives to truly flourish. And so the potential, certainly these women have real aspirations, but they're also social realists. They recognise just how difficult their path on release will be. But they have hope. And I think that we have an obligation, and a cultural obligation, and a moral obligation, and a social obligation, and a political obligation to ensure, through the work of the inquiry and through the work of all sections across government, that this work is not just the work for those that have been damaged in state care, it is the work of the nation.
Whilst speaking about obligations, do you have any comment to add Te Tiriti or Waitangi as forming part of that or not?
I think it's incredibly significant, and certainly when we travelled up and down the country, that was also one of we heard that wherever we went, particularly in smaller communities, small town communities, around the need to really recognise, in my brief in evidence, and of course Wana Jackson and Kim Workman and others have spoke to this far more elegantly than I can, around the ongoing impact of colonial and neo-colonial policies, the need for a true partnership. We saw that in the Inaya Tonu Nei report, the really important need for that. So I think that does have to be absolutely central. The restoration of mana and the ability to live a life of dignity, a life of knowing who you are, and as I often say, the right to not only know who you are, but to know why you are where you are.
Finally, that you have, by way of summary, any hopes to share for this inquiry?
And in this one, I would like to read from the brief of evidence, if I may. I believe the work of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care is of critical importance in acknowledging the harm that was done to children and the intergenerational reach of that harm. Recognition of that harm and the validation of the lives of those that experienced it is needed, as is determining the appropriate redress. Restoration of mana of the people who have been harmed through emotional, physical, psychological, sexual, verbal, institutional, and cultural harm is crucial. While the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care has a specific time span, many of the young women in prison who have experienced abuse and care sit outside of this time period. There needs to be recognition of the ongoing damage that is being caused. As noted elsewhere in the brief, in too many cases, those who experience state care follow in the footsteps of their parents and even their grandparents. In order to ensure that harm is not repeated, we need to be honest with ourselves and understand the critical role that colonialism and racism have played in establishing systems which in turn have allowed abuse in state care settings to continue. In listening to and understanding the voice of survivors and their whānau, there must be a development of strategies and an implementation that safeguards the rights and the mana of the child, that recognises how valuable they are, that cherishes and upholds the concept of mokopunatanga, that ensures that connection to whakapapa are revealed and nurtured, that understands whānau and hapu settings and works towards collective security and flourishing of all whānau. The abuse of our children in state care is one of the darkest one of our darkest chapters. In bringing it to light and not turning away from the devastation that was caused, we can seek to restore those lives and ensure that future generations thrive. Whether a child is in the care of their immediate whānau or in the care of others, that child should benefit from the knowledge that they are loved, wanted, and vital for our collective future as a nation. And I think just one thing that I'd like to add here is, with Stan, we collected his story from his own recollections, obviously, but also from the incredible level of documentation that was held by the state about him. When he read through those documents, he saw rationales about his placement, the shifts, his transitions, that he had never, as a child, had access to or been afforded of. He never knew why things happened to him when they happened to him, when he was very young. So I think it is very important, as a part of the inquiry, that we see the absolute need for people who have been placed in state care to be able to access all of their records, and that access to those records is without financial cost, and the support is in place to allow them to be able to navigate what is often very difficult systems.
Kei te puna o te ki, tēnā koe I tērā kōrero. So, thank you for that. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Merrick. Thank you, Professor. Have you been given notice by any council?
No, I haven't, sir.
I take it then there is no wish to address any questions by council to Professor. Can I then invite my colleagues, if they wish to ask any questions of Professor McIntosh? Can I start with you, Mr. Gibson? Sailofi vai.
Oh, I have a number of questions, but you have so elegantly actually framed a lot of the responses in your brief. If I could just ask you a question around the early interventions, what would those look like practically? I think as a nation, we're very good at describing what the problem is. And so to move to the next level of what could possible solutions look like, any comments on that?
Commissioner, I really think that the solutions are very much within our community. I believe, in having travelled around the country, I've listened to many of them, and many of them are very much place-based. And one of the big issues, and we have heard it in other parts of the inquiry as well, is around what resourcing would need to look like, what the shift would need to look like. At the moment, I think that many of our state agencies' resourcing and contracting of these things, one, often they're neo-colonial in terms of the particular practice of them. The sorts of KPIs that are important to the state may not actually produce really strong outcomes. One of the really important elements of early intervention is, where the need is necessary, is that it's ongoing, that it's life course engagement. So I think that's a really important element. We often have contracts that are for 6 weeks, 12 weeks. Mr. Taito the other day talked about 501s, for example. And that's an excellent example of people returning from Australia back into New Zealand, often with very, very few familial or social, financial connections here, and contracts that allow between 3 to 6 weeks of work with them, they're crimogenic. If we think about something like Steps to Freedom, of what people are released with, $350 if they meet the very difficult criteria. You think if you're released into Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, but frankly if you're released into our smaller towns, again I believe they're crimogenic in terms of it. So what we heard was around the types of interventions, about particularly if I'm speaking within a Māori settings, around the need for the hapu particularly to be their ability to identify those that can make the most sustained positive engagement in their broader whānau's lives. In some cases, you know, certainly what we're looking at is, rather than really individualised care, the importance of collective care. But, you know, the issue of poverty, the issue of insufficient income is a very significant one. It's not enough all on its own, but it is significant. People are living lives of real desperation out there, and the impact on our children is incredibly marked. So I do have confidence that we do actually have much of it. I think that, and here I'm speaking in much more my policy sort of space, that we do look for collective impact, and that's a really important element. That we do need to recognise, we do need to truly test things, and that there will be failures. I believe in a fail fast philosophy, which where you have high accountability, high transparency, and a high trust environment. Trust our people and resource them.
Thank you very much, Professor McIntosh.
Thank you, Dr. Edeweti.
Tēnā koe e tarangatira, ka nui te mihi ki a koe, Professor. I just want to ask about the numbers of Māori women in prison and how they've just escalated so quickly over recent decades. And Professor Dr. Jackson was here just recently talking about crimes of poverty, but just are you able to help us unpack that to explain what has happened?
I mean, certainly what we see here does follow international trends, which is also very concerning. And I can remember having this question asked about 12, 14 years ago in the United States with a very well-known international criminologist, American criminologist, and he was explaining the incredible increase of African American women in the prison system there. And someone asked a very similar question, you know, why is this happening? And he answered very off the cuff, in some ways taking light, and he says they're running out of men. But then he said, no, but there is something in that in regards to when you have a group that is targeted and marginalised, that it's likely to expand and that there is some escalation. I think we do have to recognise, I talked about the state's role in gang formation, and to recognise that many of these young women have grown up certainly in conditions of deprivation, but also often within a strong a gang-associated whānau. Now here I am in no way doing a blame the gangs one. I'm just more broadly saying about when you marginalise fathers and mothers, and where the gang then becomes an important space of collectivism, and then children are brought up in that, then they're likely also to experience, sometimes even harder, the level of marginalisation that others had. So that is another feature. The exclusion from the compulsory education system is just such an incredible feature, common characteristic, so that of all of the women that I've seen between 16 and 18 entering the prison in the last decade, I've only had one that wasn't excluded. Only one that wasn't excluded by 13. Some have been excluded as young as 6 from our compulsory education system. So that's an incredible characteristic. It shows the strength of the schools to be able to mitigate issues around poverty and marginalisation, but it also shows that the exclusion from that is important. The other thing is the incredible care to custody pipeline. So we often talk about the soft pipeline and the hard pipeline, and the care to custody pipeline is certainly a part of the hard pipeline. So 83% of all young Māori who come into the prison young have been in state care, with the vast majority at the time of arrest, the state was the parent. So that's, so those sorts of features, I mean, we still have, so we've got a statistical absolute blowout. Overwhelmingly our prison population is still, male. Men make up 92% of the prison population. But in talking about that 8%, when you think about when Moana Jackson wrote in 1988, He Whaipainga Hou, about how many women were in prison there compared to now, it's an astonishing increase. And that they're so young, the vast majority under 30, very, very young.
Kia ora, we were struck by that exclusion from compulsory education at such a young age, and the younger numbers of women coming through the prison system. And I wondered too whether, because we're hearing so much about stigmatisation and stereotyping of people with disabilities and Pacifica and Māori and children generally, and about whether you could see that having a role here with Māori women too, about them being stereotyped and about them internalising stereotypes, and that having a role the way that the state sees them, whether it's schools or police or child welfare officers.
Certainly, one of the things I mentioned in the brief is that for the women, their first experience of incarceration is not their first experience of confinement or of the prison. So the experience of prison has largely been through other whānau members, either fathers and mothers. But that experience of confinement, that line in that poem which came through, the worst thing in life that you never see is being captured, having never been free. Incredibly high levels of around confinement and other elements. So the stigmatisation at the broader whānau level, and the particular stigmatisation on young women, particularly those that have experienced high levels of violence, including sexual violence, some of that violence and sexual violence being under conditions of state care. There is a high level of internalisation and recognition of each other. I've sat in tables when we're sitting around and people are sharing. Now, these are young women. For me, as an older woman, they're children, sharing stories of real horror, and no one reacting to them. No one reacting to them, because these are the common stories that they heard. And in fact, I remember one woman, and actually she was an older woman, and in all of these times when we were working together, we were working on a creative piece actually, she kept talking about the terrible things that had happened to her when she was 9 years old. She kept repeating around and saying in some detail what had happened to her at 9 years old. And one of the other women just became frustrated by it, and she says, "We've all had a 9 years old." That experience that she was saying, you think it's unique to you, it's not. So I think that that's a very significant feature when you see such high levels of victimisation within the group that you're working with. The issue around healthcare, around living with disability, it is also much more heightened and marked with this group of women.
Kia ora, Professor. And you also spoke about, when my colleague Sandra Lofiva asked about solutions and interventions, you talked about a localised response, and that seemed to be a common theme that came through in your criminal justice report, yes. The first report, yeah. And I suppose in tandem with that, there's also that high level Māori working in partnership with the state in terms of the framing of policy and law. So is that part of, you see that's part of this package, if you like, of reforms?
I mean, I do think this is the work of the nation. I absolutely think that that's an important thing. The need for really, about what mokapunatanga means for us as a nation. The belief that our children's children will flourish, that that we have to have confidence in believing that. I think that one of the things that I'm sure as commissioners that you've constantly come against is, when I was listening to Dr. Sutherland's evidence last week, how could we treat our children like this? How could we treat our children like this? Children should not be vulnerable. Children should be valuable. And I think there's something as a nation. One of the things when I was with Professor Jonathan Boston co-chaired the expert advisory group on solutions to child poverty in 2012. One of the things in our, in the forum and the hui and those other things that we did for that work over that year was the incredible high tolerance we found amongst good people for children to live in poverty. That people were frightened that in supporting our tamariki, that we would reward bad parents, and that they were willing to let children suffer rather than to address the issues of poverty because of a particular frame that they had around poor parenting. So there's something that we need to, in the psyche of the nation, we can't keep saying this is a great place to bring up children until every child in this country says it was a great place to grow up. So I think that's at that much broader level. That's why I talked about the deep, profound honesty that we need to have, that this was systemic, that it has gone across decades and continues today, and that it is sustaining this incredible negative legacy, but that we have the power, I believe as a nation, that we can be absolutely global leaders in regards to our policies in terms of our child and child care. And the will is there, and the people are good, but we just, I used to say that we have a high incarceration rate. It's not just that we're tolerant of having such a high incarceration rate, but we had an enthusiasm for it. I think that enthusiasm is waning. I think we're truly in a time where people are looking for shifts and changes, that we recognise we're 4.5 million people. We're the excellent pilot study for the rest of the world. This inquiry can show real leadership in terms of how we want to see ourselves as a nation. And truly, I believe that our children, and it's not just that they're our future, but it's the mark of the nation and the way that all children are treated, and particularly those children who live on the margins. Kia ora.
Thank you. Judge Shaw.
Tēnā koe whaia. I just want to ask you about one area of our work, which is, and I'm very grateful for what you've just said about the high-level systemic matters. The Commission's also required to look into redress and what we've also been referring to as restoration. And that comes to, there are two levels of that, of course. There's the higher level and then there's the individual level. And I'm struck deeply by your reference to the lack of access to education or the denial of education, the denial of health, the denial of security. I don't expect you to answer this right now because it would be, unless you are already on top of it. But speaking to your women, your wahine, do you have a sense of what the state could do, even in a small way, to give some redress for the individual hurts that they have suffered and the damage that they have suffered?
I mean, one, I'm always taken by the generosity of the women I've worked with, given the difficulties of their lives, and they truly are already thinking of that next generation. They do not want the next generation to experience the things that they've experienced. So I think that's just shows in terms of that generosity of spirit. Certainly education, without a doubt, has been, as I said, the work that we do is human work, but it is around learning together. And whilst the women, they're excluded from school so early, and often their schooling experience was not a good one, and yet I see that flourishing of the opportunities when those opportunities are provided. So I think education is an incredibly important element of thinking about as part of the redress. There will need to be, and the inquiry is part of this, the education for the nation, that this actually happened and is happening. So I think that there is that redress. And broader sense of compensation, whatever that might look like, the restoration of mana seems to be central in all of the kōrero that I've had with people individually and in groups. And in some ways, I think that compensation will probably be most beneficial at the collective level, though there will be instances where the individual redress is seen as important. If I think about things like ACC-sensitive claims, for example, I'm not saying that is the model, but it is a model that could be reflected on and thought about.
Because that's a model that has monetary compensation but also provides
That's right.
ongoing support and counselling and whatever is required.
Yes,
Yeah.
and also, and the other thing, I guess, with the ACC model, which is at the moment different than what we would see in terms of, say, with WINS, is that the ACC model, in terms of injury, provides access back into a workplace, support for getting types of work, all of those things. So sustainable livelihoods is a very important part of a redress system. Education, sustainable livelihoods, the ability to live one's life as Māori, as Pacifica, as whatever we are, be able to live our lives as that, to live lives that allow dignity and allow full participation in your community. I think those are very significant areas, and these are complex ones for us as a nation to deal with. When I think about the $1.2 billion that we presently spend on incarceration, we heard this morning around, there was around if you had early intervention, particularly around a range of issues, what this would do for adult and adolescent engagement. And I think we can see the same things here. We spend $1.2 billion every year. Think about what the treaty settlements are. Supposed to be full and final. that's redress and supposed to be the flourishing of an iwi, think about what their quantum is compared to what we're spending every year in locking up our people, and largely locking up Māori. So it's not that we don't have the levers, it's the need to have the courage, conviction, consciousness, and the will, including the political will, to make those changes.
I apologise for saying that you might not be prepared for the question. You plainly are. But just to let you know that the Commission will, of course, be diving deeply into the issue of redress in the future. And if you want to continue thinking about it, we'd be very interested to hear from you, perhaps at a later stage in our deliberations. But tēnā koe te whaia. Thank you very much for your evidence.
Professor, I'm last of the commissioners to have an opportunity to ask you a question. I'm grateful for the wide furrow that's been created by my colleagues. I find the last 5 paragraphs of your statement and the poem which you read both evocative and compelling. And I have listened carefully to the answers you have given to my colleagues. And there is surely a huge challenge in front of the New Zealand community to deal with the problem you have laid out so eloquently. My mind can't get over the unhappy juxtaposition that there is when one drives out of Trentham and you go past the mothballed Central Institute of Technology, which is not being used, multi-storied education facility, and you drive on to Rimutaka Prison with its razor wire and electronica, where hundreds of people, many of them Māori, are incarcerated. That juxtaposition has for a long time sat unhappily with me, and I think that your challenge about needing to educate those people who are in care and in custody is one of the things which ought to be a legacy of this Royal Commission. I hope I make it obvious that I join my colleagues warmly in thanking you for your evidence. Thank you.